The morning of December 30th, 1944, Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. Commander Toshio Kusaka stood on the deck of I-400, the largest submarine ever built, watching workers seal the watertight hangar that contained 3 folded aircraft. In 8 months, this vessel and her sister ship would carry 10 specialized bombers across the Pacific to destroy the Panama Canal.
Hit the
But
subscribe
Kusaka
button
didn't know
and
that
let us know
Admiral
in the comments
Yamamoto,
from where in
the
the
man who
world you are
conceived
watching
this
from
weapon,
today.
had been dead for 20 months, shot down over Bougainville. He didn't know that Japan's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, that American submarines had strangled the supply lines, or that this revolutionary submarine would never fire a shot in anger. He only knew what the Imperial Japanese Navy told him, that this mission would change the war. The I-400 class submarines represented engineering ambition on a scale that defied imagination. 400 feet long, 39 feet wide, displacing 560 tons when submerged. They were the largest submarines the world would see until nuclear ballistic missile submarines appeared in the 1960s. Each carried enough diesel fuel to circumnavigate the globe 1.5 times without refueling. A crew of between 157 and 200 men, 8 torpedo tubes, a 140mm deck gun, 3 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and a cylindrical, watertight hangar 102 feet long and 11 feet in diameter that could store 3 attack aircraft. The concept had emerged from a specific strategic calculation. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto conceived an audacious plan. Submarine-launched aerial attacks against American coastal cities, New York, Washington, San Francisco, strike the American mainland directly, shatter civilian morale, force negotiations. On January 13, 1942, he submitted his proposal to Fleet Headquarters. 18 large submarines, each capable of 3 round trips to the U.S. West Coast without refueling, or 1 round trip to any point on Earth, each carrying at least 2 attack aircraft armed with torpedoes or 1,800-pound bombs. The proposal revealed Yamamoto's understanding of industrial warfare. Japan could not win a prolonged conflict with America's manufacturing capacity. Every analysis confirmed this. But a series of devastating strikes against American cities might convince the public that victory was impossible, that the cost of fighting Japan exceeded any possible gain. It was psychological warfare, weaponized through engineering. By March 17, 1942, general design plans were finalized. The submarines would use a unique figure of 8 hull cross-section. The upper circle contained the aircraft hangar, integrated with the offset conning tower. The lower circle housed the pressure hull. This configuration provided structural strength to support the hangar's weight without making the submarine top-heavy. Stability calculations showed it would dive to 330 feet, shallower than American fleet submarines, but adequate for Pacific operations. The aircraft hangar opened hydraulically from inside or manually from outside. A 51mm thick rubber gasket created the watertight seal. Forward of the hangar, an 85-foot compressed air catapult stretched to the bow. The system could launch a fully loaded bomber from a cold start. 4 crewmen could roll an aircraft from the hangar, attach its floats, and prepare it for launch in 7 minutes. Operational doctrine called for surfacing, launching all 3 aircraft, then diving before enemy forces could respond. But the submarines required specialized aircraft. Nothing in the Imperial Japanese Navy's inventory could fold small enough to fit in an 11-foot diameter cylinder. In June 1942, the Navy Air Service issued requirements to Aichi, a folding attack aircraft, range of 810 nautical miles, speed of 300 knots, capable of carrying torpedoes or bombs, able to fit 3 units in a submarine hangar. Aichi's engineers created the M6A1 Seiran Mountain Haze, a 2-seat, low-wing monoplane powered by an Aichi Atsuta 30 liquid-cooled V12 engine producing 1,410 horsepower. Licensed copy of the German Daimler-Benz DB601. The wings rotated 90 degrees and folded hydraulically against the fuselage. The horizontal and vertical stabilizers folded down. When collapsed, the aircraft fit precisely within the cylindrical hangar. The original specification eliminated landing gear entirely. These were throwaway weapons. Launch, attack, ditch near the submarine, rescue the crew. But engineers reconsidered. Detachable twin floats would allow the aircraft to land, be recovered by crane, and fly again. The floats could be jettisoned mid-flight for increased performance or removed entirely for one-way missions. Maximum speed without floats, 295 miles per hour. With floats, 245. Range, 642 nautical miles. Service ceiling, 32,480 feet. Armament reflected the aircraft's strike role. 113mm Type II machine gun. Rear facing for defense. Primary payload, one Type 91 torpedo, or one 1,874-pound bomb, or two 551-pound bombs. The bomb bay accommodated various configurations depending on mission requirements. But engineering brilliance met industrial reality. Steel shortages forced production cutbacks. The original 18 submarine order dropped to 9, then 5, then 3. Construction on I-400 began at Kure Naval Yard in January 1943. I-401 followed at Sasebo in April. Progress was agonizingly slow. Resource shortages, labor shortages, American air raids, disrupting production. And on April 18, 1943, the entire strategic calculation changed. Admiral Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber at Rabaul for an inspection tour of forward bases. American cryptographers had intercepted the travel itinerary 5 days earlier. The message contained departure times, routes, aircraft types, escort details, everything needed for an ambush. 16 P-38 Lightnings launched from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal on a 420-mile intercept mission. At precisely 9:35 a.m., Lieutenant Douglas Canning spotted the Japanese formation. 11 o'clock high. Yamamoto was punctual. So were the Americans. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove toward the two Betty bombers. The 6-0 escorts scattered. Barber closed on Yamamoto's aircraft from behind. 50 caliber rounds tore through the fuselage. The bomber's left engine erupted in flames. The wing sheared off. The aircraft plunged into the jungle near Bougainville. Search parties found Yamamoto the next day, still strapped in his seat, white-gloved hand gripping his katana. 2 wounds, one in the left shoulder, one through the lower left jaw, exiting above the right eye. The autopsy determined the head wound killed him instantly. Before the crash, Japan's public learned nothing until May 21st. When the announcement came, it described Yamamoto as having died gallantly in combat while directing frontline operations. The truth, that American fighters had specifically targeted and killed him, remained classified. As did the method, that American cryptographers had read Japanese naval codes. Yamamoto's death fundamentally altered the I-400 program. His replacement, Admiral Minachi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision and political influence. Production orders dropped further. Conservative naval commanders questioned the entire concept. Attacks on American cities seemed increasingly unrealistic as Japan's defensive perimeter collapsed. Guadalcanal had fallen. The Battle of Midway had destroyed 4 fleet carriers. American industrial production overwhelmed Japanese shipyards, yet construction continued. I-400 was commissioned on December 30th, 1944. I-401 on January 8th, 1945. I-402 was completed in July 1945, but finished as a fuel tanker, not an aircraft carrier. I-403 was 95% complete when work stopped in June. American air raids on July 28 severely damaged the hull. It was scuttled. E-404 and I-405 were cancelled before construction began. The Seiran aircraft faced similar production delays. The first prototype flew in November 1943, but an earthquake near Nagoya on December 7, 1944 disrupted production. An American air raid on March 12, 1945, destroyed facilities. Labour shortages became critical. Many aircraft workers were 12 to 15-year-old schoolgirls. Total production, 28 aircraft, 8 prototypes, 18 M6A1 production models, 2 M6A1K Nanzan land-based trainers with retractable landing gear. By January 1945, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. American forces controlled the Philippines. B-29 superfortresses bombed Japanese cities with impunity. The Imperial Navy's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. American submarines sank tankers faster than Japan could replace them. Yet naval planners developed a new target, not American cities, the Panama Canal. The logic was straightforward. If Japan couldn't defeat American forces in the Pacific, cut their supply line from the Atlantic. The Panama Canal's Gatun locks raised ships 85 feet through 3 chambers. Destroy the locks, empty Gatun Lake, block the canal for months, force American reinforcements and supplies to travel around South America, adding thousands of miles and weeks of transit time. It wouldn't win the war, but it might buy time, demonstrate Japan's reach, create leverage for negotiations. Japanese engineers had helped construct the canal. Intelligence officers possessed detailed construction plans. They knew every structural weakness, the massive concrete gates, the hydraulic systems, the electrical facilities. The plan took shape. 4 submarine aircraft carriers, I-400 and I-401, each carrying 3 Sarans, I-13 and I-14, smaller AM-class submarines modified to carry 2 Sarans each, 10 aircraft total. The submarines would sail eastward across the Pacific, a 2-month journey. At a point 100 miles off Ecuador, they would surface at 3 a.m. under moonlight. The Sarans would launch without floats for maximum performance, fly northeast at 4,000 meters altitude across Colombia's northern coast, turn west over the Caribbean, approach the canal from the north at dawn, the direction American defenses least expected. 6 aircraft would carry torpedoes, targeting the lock mechanisms. 4 would carry 1,874-pound bombs, targeting the gates and electrical systems. After completing their runs, the aircraft would return to a designated rendezvous point and ditch. The submarines would surface and recover the crews. But Captain Tatsunosuke Arizumi, appointed to command the mission, modified the plan in April 1945. The Saran pilots would use kamikaze ramming tactics, crash directly into the lock gates. Explosive-laden aircraft guaranteed destruction even if bombs failed to penetrate. The aircrews were not immediately informed of this change. Training began in earnest. By June 1, 1945, all 4 submarines received fuel and snorkel equipment. The snorkels, breathing tubes allowing diesel engines to operate while submerged, extended underwater range dramatically. On June 2, I-400 departed Kure via the Shimonoseki Strait, Tsushima Strait, and Sea of Japan, arriving at Nanao Bay on the western coast of Honshu on June 5. Nanao Bay had been chosen for specific reasons: remote, protected from observation, and it contained something remarkable. The Maizuru Naval Arsenal had constructed a full-scale wooden model of the Gatun locks, mounted on a raft and towed into position. The entire triple flight mechanism that lowered ships 85 feet, every dimension accurate. On June 6, formal training commenced. The Saran flight crews practiced rapid assembly, catapult launch procedures, aircraft recovery, rudimentary formation flying. From June 15 onward, the pilots made practice daylight bombing runs against the wooden mock-up. They learned approach angles, optimal release points, evasive maneuvers. By June 20th, all training ended. The operation was set to proceed. Then reality intervened. On June 21st, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa collapsed. 82 days of brutal combat, over 12,000 American dead, over 100,000 Japanese military dead, unknown numbers of Okinawan civilians killed. American forces now possessed air bases 600 miles from mainland Japan. Reports reached Tokyo that the Allies were preparing a massive invasion of the home islands. 15 American aircraft carriers had assembled at Ulithi Atoll, preparatory to launching sustained raids. The Naval General Staff convened. The Panama Canal attack, they concluded, would have minimal impact. Even if successful, it wouldn't prevent the imminent invasion. The submarines and aircraft represented irreplaceable strategic assets. Using them on a distant target that couldn't alter the war's outcome was wasteful. More direct, immediate action was necessary. On June 12, 1945, Imperial General Headquarters cancelled the Panama Canal strike. A new target was designated, Ulithi Atoll, the massive American anchorage in the Caroline Islands, 15 fleet carriers, dozens of support vessels. If Japanese forces could strike the carriers while concentrated in port, inflict catastrophic damage, it might delay or disrupt the planned invasion. The new plan, designated Operation Arashi, Mountain Storm, involved 2 phases. In the first phase, codenamed Hikari, Shining Light, submarines I-13 and I-14 would transport 4 Nakajima C-6 N-1 Sayun reconnaissance aircraft to Truk Island. These long-range, high-speed aircraft would be disassembled, crated, loaded into the submarine's watertight hangars. Upon reaching Truk, the aircraft would be reassembled and flown over Ulithi to confirm carrier locations. In the second phase, I-400 and I-401 would launch their 6 M6A1 Sairans on a nighttime strike. Each pilot would receive a hormone injection to improve night vision. Each plane carried an 800-kilogram bomb. Using reconnaissance intelligence, they would target the carriers. After the strike, the aircraft would land near the submarines. All 4 submarines would then proceed to Singapore, where 10 new Seiran aircraft awaited them for subsequent missions. But the Seirans required disguise. International law prohibited using enemy markings in combat, yet operation planners decided the aircraft would be painted with American insignia. White stars on blue circles, U.S. Army Air Forces markings. If American gunners hesitated even momentarily, confused by the markings, it might provide the critical seconds needed to reach their targets. The violation of law was deemed acceptable given Japan's desperate situation. Training continued at Nanao Bay. All 6 M6A1 float planes took off from the water on June 19th for final exercises. 1 aircraft failed to return. The bodies of its 2 crewmen washed ashore on Sadogashima days later. On July 13th, I-400 departed Nanao Bay for Maizuru, arriving the same day with I-401. On July 20th, the submarine flotilla departed Maizuru. On July 22nd, they arrived at Ominato on northern Honshu, where all crew received 1 day's leave. This would be their final time on Japanese soil. While the submarines were moored at Ominato, workers painted fake American markings on all 6 aircraft, white stars. Identification numbers. The crews also painted American hull numbers on the submarines themselves. These markings violated both Japanese military honor and international law. But honor was a luxury Japan could no longer afford. On July 23rd, at 2 p.m., the submarines departed. I-400 took a slightly different route than the others to reduce detection risk. They headed southeast into the vast Pacific. Destination, Ulithi Atoll. 2,800 miles distant. Expected transit time, 3 weeks. The submarines ran submerged during daylight, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and refresh air. The snorkel equipment allowed continuous diesel operation, extending range and reducing surface exposure. Aboard I-400, Commander Kusaka maintained operational readiness. Daily aircraft inspections. Engine preheating system tests. Catapult maintenance. The crew practiced launch procedures repeatedly. 7 minutes from hangar door opening to aircraft in flight. Any delay increased vulnerability to counterattack. The compressed air catapult system had to function perfectly. Any malfunction meant aircraft and crew losses. The Seiran pilots lived in cramped quarters adjacent to the hangar. Limited space, no privacy, hot, humid conditions, no flushing toilets. The crew had to sleep in passageways and on decks when off-duty, but the pilots maintained focus. They studied reconnaissance photographs of Ulithi, memorized carrier silhouettes, please take a mental rehearsal of their and enable notifications. Each man knew this was likely a one-way mission.
In-depth content
the hormone
like
injections might improve night vision. But landing float planes in darkness, near submarines without navigation lights, was extraordinarily difficult. Most expected to die in the attack or in attempted recovery. As the submarines proceeded southeast, the world was changing in ways the crews could not know. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. On August 6th, a single B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 70,000 dead instantly. The city vaporized. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. 40,000 dead. The Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria. Japan's Kwantung Army, the nation's premier fighting force, collapsed within days. The submarine crews knew none of this. They maintained radio silence. They had no way to receive general broadcasts. They only received encrypted naval communications, and those communications were becoming increasingly desperate. The submarines were approximately 1,500 miles from Ulithi when everything changed. At 9 p.m. on August 18, 1945, aboard I-401, Captain Arizumi received orders from the 6th Fleet. Cancel the Ulithi attack. All submarines were ordered to proceed to Kure. The message included instructions to surface, hoist black flags of surrender, and disarm. The crews were stunned. Surrender? Impossible. Japan didn't surrender. The concept violated every principle they had been taught. Bushido, the warrior code, death before dishonor, but the orders were authenticated, verified, unambiguous. On August 22nd, the crews followed their instructions. They assembled the 3 Seiran aircraft on each submarine. The engines were not started. The wings and stabilizers remained folded. Using the catapult system, they launched all 6 aircraft unmanned into the Pacific. The float planes hit the water and sank immediately, folded wings preventing them from floating. The crews then fired all torpedoes without arming them, dumped all bombs overboard, burned all logs, charts, codebooks, secret documents. Everything that might provide intelligence value to the enemy was destroyed. On August 27, 1945, at noon 500 miles northeast of Tokyo, American destroyers USS Blue and USS Mansfield intercepted I-400. Aircraft from Task Force 38 had spotted the submarine on the surface earlier. The destroyers closed rapidly. Through signal flags and radio, the American commands were clear. Stop, surrender. The Japanese flag was lowered. A black flag was raised, the universal signal of surrender. American sailors boarded cautiously, weapons ready. What they found astonished them. The submarine was longer than USS Blue itself, nearly 25 feet longer, wider than any American fleet submarine. And the cylindrical structure on the deck, they initially thought it was for cargo. Then they opened the hangar door. The watertight seal released with a hiss of pressurized air. The massive door swung open hydraulically. Inside, faint outlines were visible. Rail systems, equipment racks, oil heating chambers. This wasn't a cargo hold. This was an aircraft hangar, on a submarine. The destroyer's captain radioed Task Force 38 headquarters. We've captured something unprecedented. Request immediate intelligence support. Within hours, naval intelligence officers arrived. They photographed everything, measured dimensions, interviewed crew members through interpreters. The Japanese officers cooperated minimally. They answered direct questions, but volunteered nothing. They maintained military discipline, even in defeat. On August 31st, at 5 a.m., the American flag was raised above I-400 for the first time. A prize crew from the submarine tender USS Proteus, 4 officers and 40 enlisted men, took operational control. They would sail the submarine to Sasebo, Japan, for detailed examination. What the Americans discovered would fundamentally influence submarine design for decades. The figure-of-8 hull configuration, the aircraft storage and launch systems, the extended range enabled by massive fuel capacity, the snorkel technology allowing prolonged submersion. All of it represented thinking beyond conventional submarine doctrine. But they also discovered something else: personal items in the crew quarters. Photographs, letters. The pilots' quarters contained final messages to families, unopened. These men had expected to die at Ulithi. They had written farewell letters, made peace with death. Then fate had intervened. One American officer later described the atmosphere aboard the captured submarine. Quote, "These men were prepared for death. They had trained for a suicide mission. When the surrender orders came, they didn't know how to process it. Some seemed relieved. Others appeared broken. They had steeled themselves for death. Survival felt like failure." Unquote. I-400 and I-401 were sailed to Japan, then to Pearl Harbor for extensive study. American engineers documented every system. Naval architects analyzed the hull design. Weapons experts examined the catapult mechanism. Intelligence officers interrogated crew members for months. The Soviets demanded access to inspect the submarines. The relationship between America and the USSR was already deteriorating. Rather than sharing technology, the US Navy decided to destroy the evidence. On June 4, 1946, I-400 was towed off Kalaeloa near Oahu, Hawaii. USS Trumpetfish fired 3 torpedoes. All hit. The submarine that could circumnavigate the globe sank in minutes. I-401 was similarly destroyed. I-402, converted to a tanker and never operationally used, was sunk off the Goto Islands. The I-400 class submarines remained forgotten for decades. Their wreckage lay undisturbed 2,300 feet, underwater off Hawaii. In 2013, the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory discovered I-400's remains, remarkably intact, the figure-of-8 hull structure still visible, the hangar door sealed, a monument to Japan's most ambitious and ultimately futile submarine program. The question that haunted post-war analysis was simple: what if? What if the submarines had been completed earlier? What if Yamamoto had survived to push the program? What if Japan's resource situation had allowed construction of all 18 submarines? Could submarine-launched airstrikes have altered the war's outcome? Naval historians generally agree, no. American industrial capacity was too overwhelming. By 1944, the US was launching fleet carriers monthly, building submarines faster than losses, producing aircraft by the thousands. Even catastrophic strikes on American cities or the Panama Canal couldn't reverse these material advantages. Japan's fundamental problem wasn't tactical or technological. It was strategic. Fighting a war of attrition against an opponent with 10 times the industrial capacity was unwinnable. But the I-400 class represented something significant beyond military impact. They demonstrated that defeated nations often innovate most desperately, that engineering brilliance can't overcome strategic impossibility, that the most advanced weapons sometimes arrive too late to matter. The Seiran pilots who trained at Nanao Bay, practicing strikes against wooden mock-ups of the Panama Canal, were preparing for a mission that strategic reality had already made irrelevant. They were extraordinarily skilled, exceptionally brave, willing to die for objectives their nation could no longer achieve. One surviving Seiran aircraft exists, surrendered to American occupation forces by Lieutenant Kazuo Akatsuka, who ferried it from Fukuyama to Yokosuka. The US Navy donated it to the Smithsonian Institution in November 1962. Restoration took 11 years, from June 1989 to February 2000. It now resides at the Udvar Hazy Center near Washington Dulles International Airport. Visitors can see the folding wings, the collapsible stabilizers, the sleek, streamlined design. every element optimized for fitting into an 11-foot cylinder. The aircraft sits silent behind plexiglass, perfectly preserved, yet it represents something profound. The last physical remnant of a weapon system, conceived in desperation, engineered with brilliance, and deployed too late to change anything. Every rivet tells a story of workers laboring through air raids. Every panel speaks to engineers solving problems that had never been confronted before. Every control surface demonstrates the ingenuity that emerges when nations face existential threat. But technology alone never determines outcomes. The I-400 class submarines were engineering marvels. They genuinely were the largest submarines built until nuclear vessels appeared 20 years later. Their range exceeded anything contemporary. Their aircraft carrier capability was unprecedented. Yet all of this meant nothing because strategic realities had already condemned Japan to defeat. The mathematics were unforgiving. By 1944, American shipyards produced one escort carrier every month. Every 5 days, another destroyer. Every week, dozens of aircraft. Japan's entire annual production equaled what American factories produced in weeks. The I-400 program required resources Japan couldn't spare. Steel for 3 submarines meant sacrificing destroyers. Fuel for training meant less aviation gasoline for home defense. Every engineer assigned to the submarine project was unavailable for desperately needed repair work on damaged vessels. The Panama Canal operation revealed the fundamental disconnect between Japanese planning and military reality. Even if all 4 submarines had reached Ecuador undetected, even if all 10 Seiran aircraft had successfully struck the Gatun locks, even if every bomb and torpedo had hit precisely as planned, the strategic impact would have been minimal. American forces already dominated the Pacific. The canal's closure for 6 months wouldn't prevent the invasion of Japan. It would inconvenience supply lines, nothing more. American planners had already anticipated potential canal disruption. Contingency plans existed for routing shipping around South America. Additional ports on the Pacific coast could handle increased traffic. The transit time increase, while significant, wouldn't cripple operations. Japan's intelligence services should have known this. Perhaps they did, but acknowledging such realities would have meant admitting the war was lost, something Japanese military leadership refused to do. The training at Nanao Bay demonstrated meticulous preparation for a mission increasingly divorced from strategic sense. The pilots practiced bombing runs for hours. They memorized every detail of the Gatun lock structure. They calculated optimal approach angles, release points, evasive maneuvers. They prepared for every contingency except the one that mattered. That the target, even if destroyed, couldn't change the war's outcome. Captain Arizumi's decision to convert the mission to kamikaze tactics revealed the growing desperation. Initially, the plan allowed for pilot recovery. The aircraft would ditch near the submarines after attacking. Crews would be rescued. Aircraft were expendable, but trained pilots were valuable. By April 1945, that calculation had changed. Japan's situation had deteriorated so catastrophically that even trained pilots had become expendable. Kamikaze attacks guaranteed target destruction. Pilot survival became irrelevant. The Seiran pilots' response to this change remains unclear. No first-hand accounts survive, but based on contemporary descriptions of kamikaze training, most pilots likely accepted the modification with resignation. They had volunteered for extremely dangerous missions. The distinction between probable death and certain death perhaps seemed minimal. Japanese military culture had prepared them psychologically for sacrifice. The transformation from attack mission to suicide mission was presented as tactical optimization, not murder. The hormone injections planned for the Ulithi raid illustrated medical ethics collapsing under military necessity. Injecting pilots with substances to improve night vision carried unknown risks, but those risks were acceptable because the pilots were already condemned. Their bodies had become weapons delivery systems. Medical considerations were secondary to mission success. This utilitarian calculation characterized much of Japan's late-war strategy. Individuals didn't matter. Only national survival mattered. When the submarines departed Ominato on July 23rd, they carried approximately 800 men toward a target that no longer mattered. The strategic situation had shifted so dramatically that even successful attack would have been pointless. But the crews didn't know this. They believed they were executing a potentially war-changing mission. They maintained discipline, performed their duties, prepared for combat, all while heading toward obsolescence. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened while the submarines were en route to Ulithi. On August 6th, 140,000 people in Hiroshima died instantly or within months. On August 9th, 70,000 in Nagasaki. These single weapons delivered more destructive power than the entire I-400 flotilla could have achieved. The submarines, designed to strike devastating blows from unexpected directions, had been rendered strategically irrelevant by physics and engineering beyond Japan's capacity to match. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 9th completed Japan's strategic collapse. The Kwantung Army, over 600,000 men, Japan's most powerful ground force, crumbled within weeks. Soviet armor and mechanized infantry overwhelmed prepared positions. Japan had relied on Soviet neutrality to maintain its defensive perimeter. That calculation proved catastrophically wrong. With the Soviets invading from the north, American forces approaching from the south, and the home islands under constant bombardment, continuing the war meant only one thing: national annihilation. Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender was unprecedented. Japanese emperors didn't involve themselves in military decisions. That Hirohito personally intervened demonstrated how desperate the situation had become. On August 15th, his radio address informed the Japanese people that the war was over. Most Japanese had never heard the emperor's voice. The formal, archaic language was barely comprehensible, but the meaning was clear. Japan had surrendered, unconditionally. Aboard the submarines, this information arrived 3 days later. The encrypted message from 6th Fleet headquarters was brief. Hostilities have ceased. Cancel all offensive operations. Proceed to nearest Japanese port. Hoist black surrender flags. Disarm all weapons. The communications officer who decoded the message brought it to Captain Arizumi on I-401. Arizumi read it 3 times before speaking. His response isn't recorded, but crew members later described him as visibly shaken. The order to destroy the aircraft must have been agonizing. These sirens represented years of development, months of training. They were perfect examples of specialized engineering. Each aircraft had been hand-built by craftsmen working through air raids and resource shortages. Each represented hundreds of hours of labor, and they had never fired a shot in combat, never dropped a bomb on an enemy target, never fulfilled their purpose. Now they would be launched unmanned into the Pacific to prevent capture. The catapult crews performed their final duty with precision. They wheeled each aircraft from the hangar onto the launch rails, checked the catapult pneumatic systems, armed the launching mechanism, but they didn't unfold the wings, didn't extend the stabilizers, didn't start the engines. The aircraft were launched as folded cargo, not as functional weapons. When the catapult fired, each Seiran shot forward off the bow and plunged into the ocean. Wings still folded, they sank immediately. No ceremony. No speeches. Just machinery disappearing into the Pacific. Firing the torpedoes without arming them followed the same pattern. Each submarine had 8 tubes loaded. The torpedoes represented Japan's most advanced underwater weapons. Oxygen-fueled Type 95 and Type 97 torpedoes. Long range, powerful warheads, difficult to detect. They had never been fired at enemy ships. Now they were expelled into the ocean, their propellers spinning uselessly, until fuel exhausted and they sank. Empty tubes, empty purpose. Destroying the documents took longer. Code books, navigation charts, orders, intelligence reports, personnel files. Every piece of paper that might provide information to the enemy had to be burned. The submarines weren't equipped with incinerators large enough for this volume of material. The crews used metal drums on deck, feeding papers into fires, while the submarines drifted on the surface. The process took hours. Smoke rose in columns, visible for miles. Any American aircraft or ship could have spotted them. But at this point, it didn't matter. The war was over. When USS Blue and USS Mansfield intercepted E-400 on August 27th, the American crews expected a standard submarine. Japan had built many capable submarines during the war. The I-class fleet submarines were well known, but nothing had prepared the Americans for what they found. The sheer size was immediately apparent. One sailor later described it as looking like a surfaced whale. Another compared it to a small surface ship that happened to be submersible. The American boarding party approached cautiously. Surrendered or not, Japanese forces had a reputation for fanaticism. Fears of booby traps or suicide attacks were prevalent, but the Japanese crew offered no resistance. They stood on deck in formation, silent, as American sailors climbed aboard. The American officer in charge later described the scene as surreal. Quote, "These were defeated men who maintained perfect military bearing, not defiant, not broken, just, resigned. They had prepared for death. They received orders to surrender. They obeyed. But you could see they didn't understand it." Unquote. The hangar discovery came when an American engineering officer noticed the cylindrical structure and asked through an interpreter what it contained. The Japanese officer's response was terse. Aircraft hangar. The interpreter needed clarification. Aircraft? On a submarine? The Japanese officer simply nodded and demonstrated the hydraulic door mechanism. When the door opened and the Americans saw the interior, the implications were immediately apparent. This wasn't a cargo submarine. This was an underwater aircraft carrier. The report sent to Task Force 38 headquarters caused immediate excitement. Naval intelligence had intercepted references to special Japanese submarine projects, but details were scarce. Suddenly, here was physical evidence of Japanese submarine-launched air capability. If Japan possessed multiple such submarines, the strategic implications were significant. Submarine-based aircraft could strike targets far beyond conventional submarine torpedo range. They could attack ships in port, coastal installations, even inland targets near coastlines. They represented a genuine tactical innovation. The subsequent investigation revealed just how innovative the design was. The figure of 8 hull cross-section solved structural problems that had stymied American submarine designers. The snorkel system extended underwater endurance dramatically. The aircraft storage and launch mechanisms were elegantly engineered. Even the engine oil preheating system demonstrated creative problem-solving. American submarine designers had occasionally considered aircraft-carrying submarines, but dismissed the concept as impractical. The Japanese had made it work. But American investigators also discovered the program's limitations. The submarines were slower than fleet submarines. Their diving depth was shallower. The crew accommodations were inadequate for extended operations. Most critically, the fuel consumption was enormous. Even with enough diesel to circumnavigate the globe, the submarines consumed fuel at rates that limited operational flexibility. And Japan's fuel shortage in 1945 meant these submarines could barely operate even if more had been completed. The prize crews, who sailed I-400 and I-401 to Sasebo, then to Pearl Harbor, dealt with mechanical problems throughout. Systems designed for Japanese crews, maintained by Japanese technicians, operated by personnel who understood every quirk. American crews, even with Japanese advisors aboard, struggled. Language barriers complicated everything. Technical manuals were in Japanese. Equipment labeling was in Japanese. Emergency procedures were written in Japanese. Operating a foreign submarine while learning its systems through interpreters was extraordinarily difficult. At Pearl Harbor, American engineers spent months documenting every system. They measured every compartment, photographed every component, interviewed Japanese crew members extensively. The intelligence value was substantial, but so was the concern. If the Soviets obtained access to this technology, they could develop their own submarine aircraft carriers. The Cold War was already beginning. Soviet naval capabilities were expanding rapidly. Sharing submarine technology with the Soviets was strategically unacceptable. The decision to destroy the submarines was made at the highest levels. President Truman was briefed on the captures and the Soviet requests for access. The recommendation from naval leadership was unambiguous. Destroy the submarines, study them thoroughly first, document everything, but prevent Soviet access. The precedent of submarine-launched aircraft could not be allowed to spread. The final disposition of I-400 occurred on June 4, 1946, nearly 10 months after surrender. The submarine was towed to deep water off Hawaii. USS Trumpetfish, a Balao-class submarine, positioned for the attack. 3 torpedoes were fired. All struck the target. The I-400, which could have travelled 37,500 nautical miles on 1 tank of fuel, sank in minutes. Its revolutionary design, its unprecedented capabilities, its meticulous engineering, all disappeared beneath the Pacific. One could argue this was waste, that these submarines represented valuable historical artifacts, that they should have been preserved for study, for museums, for future generations to understand. But 1946 was different from today. The war had just ended. Millions were dead. Nations were choosing sides for the next conflict. Sentiment played no role in strategic decisions. These submarines represented dangerous technology. Their destruction was deemed necessary. No debate occurred. The surviving Seiran aircraft at the Smithsonian is the sole physical reminder of this entire program. Visitors pass by it regularly. Most don't recognize its significance. It looks like another World War II Japanese aircraft. Sleek, well-designed, unremarkable. The placard explains its purpose. Submarine-launched attack bomber. Few people stop to read the details. Fewer still contemplate what it represents. That single aircraft embodies the trajectory of Japan's war effort. Initial innovation and success. Growing desperation. Increasingly complex solutions to insurmountable strategic problems. Meticulous engineering applied to futile objectives. Brave men prepared to die for missions that couldn't succeed. And ultimately, surrender, capture, and historical footnote status. The pilots who trained at Nanao Bay survived. The submarine crews survived. They returned to a Japan that barely resembled the nation they had left. Cities destroyed, millions dead, economy collapsed, government restructured under American occupation. The world they had fought to preserve had been annihilated. Their sacrifices, their training, their willingness to die, all rendered meaningless by atomic weapons and strategic exhaustion. Some crew members later emigrated. A few eventually visited the United States. Several attended reunions with American veterans who had captured or studied the submarines. These encounters were reportedly cordial, but emotionally complex. Former enemies discussing weapons systems that never saw combat, comparing experiences from opposite sides of an ended conflict, attempting to find meaning in missions that strategic realities had made irrelevant before they even launched. The I-400 class submarines influenced post-war submarine design, particularly Soviet programs. Although the Soviets never directly examined the Japanese submarines, intelligence reports and technical assessments provided enough information. Soviet submarine designers developed their own aircraft-carrying concepts in the late 1940s. None reached production. The emergence of submarine-launched ballistic missiles made aircraft-carrying submarines obsolete. Why launch a bomber requiring a 2-man crew and complex recovery procedures when you could launch a missile? Nuclear submarine development rendered the entire I-400 concept obsolete within 15 years. Nuclear power provided unlimited, underwater endurance. Ballistic missiles provided strike capability far exceeding any bomber. The problems the I-400 class solved, extended range and strike capability, were solved more effectively by different technology. The submarines represented an evolutionary dead end. Brilliant adaptation to constraints that new technology eliminated. The Panama Canal attack plan, studied extensively by military historians, serves as a case study in strategic delusion. Every aspect of the plan was technically feasible. The submarines could reach Ecuador, the aircraft could reach the canal, the weapons could damage the locks. But feasibility isn't strategy. A plan can be executable and still be pointless. Japan's military leadership confused capability with value. They could attack the canal, therefore they should. The failure to ask whether it would matter demonstrated how divorced planning had become from strategic reality. This disconnect appeared throughout Japan's late-war strategy. The kamikazes that attacked American ships at Okinawa were technically effective. They sank dozens of vessels, but they didn't prevent the island's capture. The tunnel systems in the Philippines that allowed prolonged resistance killed thousands of Americans. But they didn't save the Philippines. The atomic bomb development program consumed resources, but never approached viable weapons. Activity substituted for strategy. Doing something, anything, became the goal because admitting the war was lost was culturally impossible. The I-400 program exemplified this perfectly. Enormous resources, years of development, brilliant engineering, brave crews, all directed toward objectives that couldn't influence the war's outcome. If those same resources had been devoted to coastal defense, or pilot training, or agricultural production, Japan's situation wouldn't have fundamentally changed, but perhaps fewer men would have died preparing for missions that never happened. Commander Toshio Kusaka, who stood on I-400's deck in December 1944, survived the war. He returned to Japan, lived through occupation, witnessed reconstruction. Whether he ever reflected on the irony of his service is unknown. He commanded the world's largest submarine. It never fired a shot. He trained for a mission that could have changed the war. It was cancelled. He prepared to die for his nation. He was ordered to surrender instead. His entire wartime service was preparation for events that never occurred. This was true for thousands of Japanese servicemen. The emphasis on preparation, on readiness, on willingness to sacrifice, all created forces trained for battles that never happened. By the time the submarines were ready, the war was effectively over. By the time the Seiran pilots mastered their aircraft, the targets were unreachable. By the time everything was prepared, nothing mattered anymore. The 2-month journey the submarines would have taken to Ecuador illustrates the operational challenges. 2-month sailing submerged during daylight, surfaced at night, through American-controlled waters. American submarines dominated the Pacific. American aircraft patrolled shipping lanes. Detection was nearly certain. Even if the submarines reached Ecuador, the return journey would have been even more dangerous. American forces would have been alerted. The element of surprise would be gone. The submarines would have been hunted relentlessly. Survival probability was minimal. Perhaps the Japanese planners knew this. Perhaps they accepted that the submarines would be sacrificed. The mission wasn't about the submarines returning. It was about delivering 10 Seiran bombers to the Panama Canal. Whether the submarines survived was secondary. This calculus characterized much of Japanese late-war planning. Assets were expendable if they contributed to any objective, however small. The shift from Panama Canal to Ulithi made tactical sense. Ulithi was closer. The transit was shorter. The target was more valuable. 15 aircraft carriers represented genuine strategic importance. Successful attack could disrupt the planned invasion. But even this revised plan suffered from optimism bias. 10 Seiran bombers attacking 15 aircraft carriers protected by dozens of destroyers, cruisers, and anti-aircraft systems. The mathematical probability of significant damage was low. Most aircraft would be shot down before reaching targets. Even successful hits wouldn't sink fleet carriers. At best, some carriers would be damaged. The invasion would be delayed weeks. That was the maximum possible achievement. Against this minimal potential gain, the cost was substantial. 4 submarines, 10 aircraft, all crew members, plus the resources already expended developing the systems. The cost-benefit analysis was unfavorable, but by mid-1945, cost-benefit analysis no longer drove decisions. Desperation did. Any action that might inflict damage on American forces seemed worthwhile. The magnitude of that damage relative to costs incurred became irrelevant. The hormone injections planned for Ulithi raid pilots remain mysterious. What hormones? What dosage? What effects? What side effects? No documentation survives. Japanese military medical experiments during the war were extensive and often unethical. Using pilots as test subjects for performance-enhancing substances would have been consistent with documented practices. Whether the injections would have actually improved night vision is questionable, but the fact that planners included this element reveals how desperate they were. Every possible advantage, however marginal or experimental, was pursued. The painted American markings on the Seiran aircraft represented violation of the Hague Conventions. Article 23 explicitly prohibits improper use of enemy flags or insignia. The penalty for such violations is immediate loss of protected status. Captured personnel could be treated as spies rather than prisoners of war. Summary execution was legally permissible, yet operation planners included this element. Either they were ignorant of international law or they deemed legal consequences irrelevant. The pilots were kamikaze. They weren't expected to survive for capture. Legal protections didn't matter. This disregard for international legal constraints appeared throughout Japan's war conduct: the treatment of prisoners of war, the medical experiments, the forced labor, the comfort women, the biological warfare research. Japan's military leadership increasingly ignored laws of war as the conflict intensified. Whether this was calculated strategy or cultural attitude is debated, but the pattern was consistent. Military necessity superseded all other considerations. The I-400 class submarines, then, weren't just weapons, they were symbols. Symbols of Japan's technological capacity, symbols of desperation, symbols of strategic disconnect. Symbols of how nations behave when facing existential threat. They represented everything Japan could achieve when pushed to limits, and everything Japan couldn't achieve because limits exist regardless of effort. The mathematics of war are unforgiving. Industrial capacity, resource availability, geographic position, population, training time, logistics. These factors determine outcomes more than courage or innovation. Japan understood this initially. Yamamoto's famous quote about running wild for 6 months, then having no confidence, reflected accurate assessment. Japan could win early victories through surprise and preparation, but couldn't sustain conflict against superior resources. Everything that happened after Midway proved this analysis correct. The I-400 program was an attempt to circumvent these realities. If conventional forces couldn't defeat American power, perhaps unconventional forces could. If surface fleets couldn't reach American territory, perhaps submarines could. If traditional bombers couldn't strike distant targets, perhaps submarine-launched bombers could. The logic was appealing. The execution was impressive, but the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Tactical innovation couldn't overcome strategic disadvantage. This lesson resonates beyond World War II. Military history contains numerous examples of technologically advanced weapons failing to change strategic realities. German Wunderwaffen. Soviet superweapons during the Cold War. Saddam Hussein's supergun. Advanced technology impresses. It demonstrates capability. It provides propaganda value. But it rarely alters outcomes determined by larger forces. The side with greater resources, better position, and sustainable strategy wins regardless of weapon quality. The I-400 class submarines were better than anything America possessed in their niche. They genuinely were superior underwater aircraft carriers, but America didn't need underwater aircraft carriers. America had actual aircraft carriers, dozens of them, with thousands of aircraft. The Japanese solution to a problem America had already solved differently, and more effectively. This asymmetry characterized the entire Pacific War. Japan innovated within constraints. America overwhelmed constraints with production. Japan built the world's largest battleship, Yamato. America built Essex-class carriers monthly. Japan developed long-range submarines. America built 10 submarines for every Japanese one. Japan trained elite pilots. America trained pilots in such numbers that losses could be replaced. Quality versus quantity. Precision versus volume. The quantity approach won decisively. Understanding the I-400 story requires understanding this context. The submarines weren't failures of engineering. They were magnificent achievements. The problem wasn't technical. It was strategic. Japan was solving problems that couldn't change the war's outcome. Brilliantly. Expensively. Futilely. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.